This is an open hearing in Court 73 at the Royal Courts of Justice as part of the independent inquiry relating to Afghanistan. The hearing is before Lord Justice Haddon-Cave, the chair of the inquiry. Please could I ask you to ensure that all mobile telephones and other personal electronic devices are either switched off or in silent mode. Please may I also draw your attention to the fact that the chair of the inquiry, the Right Honourable Sir Charles Haddon-Cave, has made a restriction order in relation to the conduct of those who are attending this and future hearings. The full order is displayed on the inquiry website and on the door of this court and of the media annex, but I will summarise its purpose. The order which applies to this and to all future hearings of the inquiry prohibits any person from making an audio or video recording of inquiry proceedings from within the hearing rooms without the express permission of the chair. Furthermore, no person may take a photograph in any room in which inquiry proceedings are taking place and at a time the inquiry is sitting without the express permission of the chair. For the avoidance of doubt, both of these prohibitions extend to the hearing in the media annex. A further part of the order arises as the live stream of these inquiry proceedings via YouTube will purposely be subject to a 10-minute delay. It is prohibited that any person may disclose, publish or broadcast in any form or by any means anything that is said or done in the inquiry hearing room until 10 minutes after it has taken place. If an application is made for a restriction order in relation to anything that has been said or done in the inquiry hearing room in that preceding 10 minutes, anything that was said or done during that period is subject to a restriction order prohibiting its disclosure, repetition or duplication until the chair has finally determined the application. All of the above orders are subject to a penal notice. This means that any breach of any element of the restriction orders may be certified to the High Court or the Court of Session, who will have the power to fine or imprison anyone found to have been in breach of the order. Court rise.
Thank you, Admiral.
Please, sir. Admiral, we'd had your help just before lunch with the provincial reconstruction teams and the plan that had been mandated by President Karzai to effect a handover from the mentoring and advisory groups to the Afghanistan people themselves by the end of 2014. Recognising that we are not going to take ourselves in this inquiry as far as 2014, because the period we're concerned with is 2010 to 2013, can I just have your help now with the structure of the Task Force Helmand headquarters? And it may be that I'm going to also ask your help with a little more detail on the staff branch coding and also the staff officer coding. Now, can I take you in your statement, please, to paragraphs 81 onwards? And it may be that some of the information you'll find is set out in your footnote number 43. The headquarters for Task Force Helmand were based on a standard brigade headquarters structure, is that correct?
That's correct.
And the command spine of the headquarters links the commander through the Chief of Staff to a number of sub-branches.
Yes.
And were they J5, J35 and J3?
Yes. And that means J5 is the staff branch that does the planning. J3 is the branch that then does the execution. And then we've found for that to run smoothly, you have what's called the J3/5 team that do the linkages between planning and execution.
So in effect, you've got J5 team that plans the future operations, J3 that runs the live operations, and then the link between the planning and the execution, as you've told us, J35.
Yes.
Now, those staff branches, are they part of 9 separate numbered staff branches?
Yes. We adopt that structure as the UK military and many militaries, where you have the J stands for a joint branch, and then you have either a G in this circumstances for ground representing the army, or N when you're dealing with the army and with the navy, and A when it's the air force. So these are joint branches rather than single environment, purely army.
And can I use you as a vehicle simply to understand and define the different J numbers for this reason? That they feature on a number of the emails that have been made available to the core participants, and there's references to J and a different number.
Right.
And can I ask you please to look at your footnote number 43, where you have set out a definition of the individual 1 to 9 joint environment branches.
Yes, so J1 is personnel, J2 is intelligence, J3 current operations, J4 logistics and medical, J5 planning, J6 is communication and information systems, J8 is finance and human resources, J9 is policy, legal and media, and quite often we have J7, which is training.
And are those J numbers shared within the 3 separate services?
Yes.
As you told us, the G, the A or the N denoting one service from the other where appropriate?
Yes.
You told us that the command spine of the Task Force Helmand headquarters ran from the commander through the chief of staff and down to the branches J3, J5 and J35. In terms of the organisation of the structure itself and within those branches, do we have a number of sub-officers within the branches who've got the definition, for example, SO 1, 2, 3, 4 and the like?
Yes, and the SO 1, 2, 3, that refers to their rank rather than their particular J code.
So SO, does that stand for staff officer?
Yes.
And where we see SO1, is that an OF4?
That's an OF4, which in the army would be a lieutenant colonel.
And SO2 is what, please?
Would be an OF3, which in the army is a major.
And then SO3, is that OF2?
So I think you mean...
Sorry,
SO3.
Yes,
SO3 is OF2, so that would be a captain in the army.
So where we see on the documents, as we will do in due course, J followed by a number and then SO followed by a number, we'll be able to link back to the evidence you've just given us to understand the particular branch from which that person operated and also the level at which they were operating.
That's correct.
Now, I'm not going to ask you to take us through the various staff branches, but insofar as the Task Force Helmand commander received information from the different branches, were there a number of boards or groups which met either daily, weekly or monthly in order to feed back information?
Yes, so monthly, weekly and daily, in order to both collate that information, assess it, and then give direction.
And if we just deal very briefly, if we may, with some of them, insofar as the monthly meeting, was that the Joint Command Board?
Yes.
And was that principally concerned with taking policy decisions to be implemented across the province?
Yes, and it would be the more substantial decisions, and that's why it was on a less regular basis and it's operating at a slightly higher level and reviewing those aspects on a monthly basis.
So in a sense, if we starting almost at the oversight level, and then as we descend on more frequent basis of meetings, they become more granular.
Yes, that's correct.
So on a weekly basis, did the Joint Command Group meet?
Yes, again, under the commander of Task Force Helmand, who would always attend the monthly meeting, but quite frequently the Joint Command Group that was meeting weekly, the Task Force commander might only attend on alternate weeks.
And was one of the tasks of the Joint Command Group to review ongoing operations?
That's correct.
And then insofar as daily meetings, which took place within the commander's office, were they opportunities for key personnel to brief him, that's the commander, on key issues that had arisen?
Yes, so that's briefing the commander on very much the here and now, on what has happened in the previous, it may be the previous 24 hours or an even shorter period, and reviewing what's going to happen in the next 24 hours.
So if we were to start with the daily and then the weekly and the monthly, we can see how what starts with the particular key issues at the time in the daily meetings, so concerned with the last 24 hours and perhaps the next 24 hours. We then move up in detail and oversight to weekly meetings with the Joint Command Group, and then to the oversight at a strategic level with the Joint Command Board on a monthly basis.
Yes.
And those, as you've told us, were an opportunity for the commander of Task Force Helmand to receive advice from those immediately involved in operations, and then advice from those planning the operations, and then advice for those taking policy decisions in respect of them.
Yes, and an opportunity, particularly on a monthly basis, to review and assess whether or not the task force is achieving the operations that it's set out to achieve, and to understand what was going right and what needed adjusting.
So did it provide an opportunity for feedback on issues that had arisen either in the last 24 hours, the last week, or the last month, so that those could be taken into account when any ongoing operation was planned and executed?
Yes, it would, as well as being part of a broader taking stock for higher level organisations as to what is the assessment of the commander against the objectives that he's been given, so that the higher command have that view.
So at its most basic level, with the daily meeting, is that almost a performance review of how the last 24 hours has gone and how they hope the next 24 hours will go?
It is, but it's to give the commander a much more granular feel as to whether or not there are any key issues that need to be brought to his attention, and then whether or not there are any particular aspects that he needs to be aware of that are about to immediately happen.
And would that provide the ability to make an immediate change, if necessary, to either what has gone before or what is about to happen?
It would do, but ordinarily it's about an awareness of what's happened and what is happening. The more substantial changes and where things are more correctly reflected upon would be in either the weekly and the monthly group. That this is a much more tactical, this is what's just gone on. Has that gone well? Has it gone badly? Are there any particular aspects that have emerged from that? This is what's about to happen. It's a tactical feel about what is actually going on.
And of course, the advantage of the structure that's been set up is the commander is present at the daily briefings, so has direct knowledge of what has happened in the last 24 hours and what is due to happen. And with that knowledge, he can further inform his discussions in the weekly and the monthly meetings when wider, more strategic decisions are taken.
That's correct.
It avoids the risk, therefore, that whoever is taking the strategic decisions isn't aware of actually what's happening on the ground.
That's right.
Can I just ask for your help with the headquarters of the battle group within Task Force Helmand? You told us before that the battle group operated as a principal manoeuvre battle group, which was based on infantry battalion principles.
Yes.
Insofar as the composition of the battle group is concerned, when I first asked you some questions, you explained that we're dealing with a relatively large time frame, 8 separate rotations on a 6-month cycle. And I'm not going to invite you to give us the separate composition of each of those 6-month rotations and take us through 8 of them. But insofar as the configuration of the battle group is concerned, was the battle group commander an OF4 level officer?
Yes.
And what rank is that, please?
So that, for the Army, is a lieutenant colonel.
And that lieutenant colonel was assisted with the chief of staff at OF3 level?
Yes.
And that rank is what, please, Admiral?
So that, for the Army, is a major, and that role is about coordinating activity across the headquarters.
And then, as you told us already, we've got a link between J3, J5 and J35. And as far as J3 is concerned, an operations officer and J5, a future operations officer, were they both at OF2 level?
Yes, ordinarily they would be at OF2. They might occasionally be at OF3, depending on just the texture of a battle group.
As to the structure beneath them, I'm not going to take you through it, but it's set out for those that want to look at it in due course in your sub-paragraphs 89.3 and onwards. Can we turn very briefly to consider the sub-unit headquarters at your paragraph 90? And insofar as the sub-unit in the context of an infantry battle group is concerned, does that combine both an infantry company with the non-infantry elements of engineers, signals, medics and the like?
Yes.
And again, a number of separate commanders and second-in-commands at either OF3 or OF2 level?
Yes, so the company commander would be at the OF3 major level, and then the company second in command would be one notch down as an OF2 or at the captain level for the Army.
And as you've told us already, all of these units and subunits were being deployed in what you termed a ground holding role in Operation Herrick.
Yes.
Could I invite you please to turn on in your statement to page 34 and to Operation Entirety. And what I'd like to do is to have your help about that particular operation and what it meant for the UK Armed Forces. So if we look together, please, to your paragraph 95, can you give us an explanation, please, Admiral, of Operation Entirety and what it was?
Yes, so this was a response by the British Army to cope with the pressures of Afghanistan operations, but also to ensure that the people that were being deployed to Afghanistan were as best trained and situated as possible. So it's a comprehensive institutional programme to place the British Army on a campaign footing so that land forces were properly resourced, structured, and prepared both conceptually, morally, and physically to enable them to be successful in Afghanistan and other Afghanistan-type operations.
And was this an operation that was initiated in April of 2009?
Yes, and it ran for a 4-year period. And with this aim of an institutional approach by the British Army to better shape for the pressures and demands of Afghanistan, with the aim of enabling both tactical and operational success in Afghanistan.
So does it come to this, if I just break it down very briefly into, say, layman's terms? Was the purpose to put the deployed UK armed forces in a better position to achieve what the success target was in Afghanistan?
Yes.
And that was done through pre-deployment training, through training when they first arrived on deployment, and then ultimately through training whilst they continued their deployment.
It involved training, but it also involved resourcing. It also involved, in effect, directing the army, that the army would change the way that it was operating, the way that it was structured, the way that it was resourcing, all those aspects that the army has to fulfill, and giving a priority under the banner of Operation Entirety to elevate the shaping of the army's approach to prioritise towards Afghanistan.
And did the shape and structure of Operation Entirety see itself informed from lessons that had been learnt on the ground in Afghanistan?
Yes, that was a feature of Op Entirety.
So if we're imagining a 4-year period between 2009 to 2013, there or thereabouts, those who were providing the necessary training and approach with Operation Entirety were actually learning lessons throughout its programme from Afghanistan and converting those into accessible information for people being deployed.
That's correct.
So we don't want to think in terms of a rigid structure at the outset in 2009 that remained through the 4-year period. This is an organic operation which learnt as it went along.
Yes, and it's a structure that then changes in order to meet the demands of operations. So if I give you a simple example, when the threat of IEDs was growing, and you then need to find more people who can help you deal with the IED threat, you might need to generate more ammunition technical specialists, more counter-IED officers, more counter-IED operatives, and therefore you adjust the people that are coming into the army and then the training programs, and so you're making adjustments to the structure of the army, as well as all of the attributes that you've said in terms of the people that are about to go out to Afghanistan, that they're getting the latest training so that they're familiar with the best tactics and procedures to be as effective as possible.
So does it demonstrate the Army's ability to adapt quickly and to train appropriately when a lesson is perhaps vitally learnt in the short space of time?
Yes, it's a piece of institutional agility about an army responding to both the pressures and demands of Afghanistan and adjusting its shape and the way that it was operating to better meet the demands of Afghanistan.
Can I have your help then, please, with some of the pre-deployment and mission-specific training? You'll find that in the body of your statement at paragraphs 99 onwards, and it's under a section that's termed force generation and force preparation. And this presumably is all part of Operation Entirety, which we've just been discussing.
Yes.
So the ability appropriately to train troops who are about to be deployed, having learnt lessons from the battlefield.
Absolutely.
In terms of the training that was provided to deploying units, did it start with a period of foundation training?
Yes, so the foundation training is the generic training for all individuals and units that are about to deploy to Afghanistan. And then there was separate training, which we call mission-specific training, which is more tailored for a particular role that an individual or unit might be about to undertake when it is in Afghanistan.
For example, say counter-IED training, which you mentioned just a moment ago.
Yes.
As far as the mission-specific training programme is concerned, was that subject to continuous development?
Yes, so that was driven by lessons from the units being trained, as well as feedback from operations, and then also taking what we call post-operational reports and what we're learning, as well as post-operational interviews, as well as post-operational presentations, so that the people that are about to deploy to Afghanistan have the best knowledge available from what we're learning in theatre.
So just if we think about that together for a moment briefly, as part of the continuous development of the mission-specific programme, individuals, units, operations were being spoken to and studied in order to better inform the people who were delivering the training.
That's correct.
So if something had worked, presumably that would be included if it wasn't already within the training programme. But if something hadn't worked, that would lead to an adjustment within the training package.
Yes, I don't want to pretend that these are perfect systems, but in theory, that is what you're trying to do.
Now, this is an operation that began in April of 2009 and evolved during the 4-year period, as you've told us. Presumably prior to 2009, there was pre-deployment training and mission-specific training that was given to the deployed troops.
Yes.
And is it possible to explain what the difference was that was created by Operation Entirety? So if we think pre-2009, we have one training package. After 2009, we have one under the name Operation Entirety. And what, if anything, was the difference in that watershed, if it's fair to call it that?
Yes, so Operation Entirety was about this institutional reform and adjusting a very large structure called the British Army to better support operations in Afghanistan. So some of that is adjustments to resourcing, adjustments to structure, to organisations, and so on. A large part of it is also a reflection of mindset of the leadership of the army, telling the army about the crucial importance of Afghanistan, and that that's where the organisation was to be even more focused. Then when you come down to this training conversation, what it actually means is driving improvements in the training, so that the training should be more sophisticated, so that our soldiers that are deploying to Afghanistan are deploying in the best possible condition, both in terms of their equipment, their tactics, their philosophy, their mindset, to be as effective as possible when they arrive in Afghanistan.
And in terms of the development that you've described, you told us that it might come from feedback from operations. Is that feedback from individual UK service personnel, or feedback at a unit or group level, or how did that work, please?
So it would be both, but it's institutionalised so that you have post-operational reports, post-operational interviews. You've got a system that is in place to be gleaning as much as possible from what is going on, and then transferring that back to the training organisations, to the doctrine organisations, so that you can make the adjustments that are necessary to keep having what we would call is a battle-winning edge. So it's institutionalised rather than but it goes down to an individual level rather than a randomness of, do you happen to have received the correct report from an individual who may have had some experience that you want to know as an individual. It has to be institutionalised for it to bring real effect.
And in order to see real effect brought in, was the operational training and advisory group formed?
Yes, so that existed before, but then it was emphasised under Operation Entirety, so that we had a formal mechanism called OPTAG, or Operational Training and Advisory Group. that then becomes a permanent organisation to oversee both individuals and units are trained in the most up-to-date and the most relevant tactics, as well as techniques and procedures to be effective as possible in Afghanistan.
And if we just think back for a moment to where we began earlier today about the number of deployments and the rotation structure, we're dealing with 6-month cycles and therefore 8 periods of deployment in the relevant period. Presumably, if OPTAG is training the next deployed group to go out, there is an opportunity at the end of each cycle to learn what has happened in the last 6 months and to adjust it before the next team are deployed.
Yes, so the learning, it's a continuous process. So it's more than just the 6-month cycle. So the OPTAG team would be going forward and sampling the lessons that are being learned on a much more regular basis than merely every 6 months we'll try and collate and we'll make adjustments to the whole time. It's probably best viewed as ideally it's a continuum with regular updates throughout those 6-month periods, but also with more substantial updates when you get the change over a brigade.
So it would be wrong if anyone were to think that what you have is in effect a 6-month end of half-year report, which then feeds into the training for the next 6 months. This is an ongoing, organic learning taken from theatre, brought back so that those who are about to be deployed are in the best position for the winning edge, as you've called it.
That's correct.
Now, as far as OPTAG's role is concerned, in addition to ensuring that the teams about to be deployed were appropriately trained before they went to Afghanistan, were they also responsible for providing support for forces in theatre?
Yes. So you've got your pre-deployment training, which individuals and units do. And then when you get into theatre, we've got what's called RSOI, reception, staging, and onward integration. So you've now arrived in theatre, and you then have an additional package for troops that have arrived before they then go further forward to start the tasking for the reason why they're actually in Afghanistan.
And then once in the forward operating bases and carrying out the tasking, one needs to think, of course, of the daily, weekly and monthly meetings that would enable the command spine to learn lessons actually whilst operations are taking place.
Yes.
Simply for completeness, because we've dealt with pre-deployment, arrival on deployment training, we've dealt with the ability to change during the course of any deployment. Was there a post-operational decompression side to any of the training?
Yes, so that comes at the end of a unit or individual's operational deployment. And this is really to try and help from the intensity of operations to then catch a flight back, to go back to your normal domestic life, is a big jump for people to take. And so we have a period of what we call decompression, which is specifically tailored to allow people to readjust from that intensity of their operations before going back to the normality of a life back in the UK.
And was that mandatory for conventional service personnel?
Yes.
With your help then, please, can we turn to consider campaign oversight and management? We've touched upon it in part, but I'm going to take you, if you wouldn't mind, please, to your paragraph 111 onwards, dealing with the structure, governance, command and control relationships between UK, NATO, ISAF, US and Afghan governance. You'd already told us about ISAF, and we've already considered in part the link between the international and the sovereign command and the dual-hatted nature that we discussed before. As far as ISAF is concerned, established in December 2001, following a UN Security Council resolution, and then following the Bonn Agreement as well. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I think you told us, but just for clarity, ISAF headquarters was in Kabul.
Yes.
And its commanders were, in the main, US four-star generals. There was, of course, General Sinek Parker, but most were US four-stars. Is that correct?
That's right. And in the period for this inquiry, General McChrystal, June 2009 to June 2010, General Petraeus, July 2010 to July 2011, General Allen, 2011 to February 2013, and then General Dunford, February 2013 to August 2014.
And we'll come on a little later to consider some of those individuals, and in particular some of the additional information you've provided. Insofar as the NATO command of ISAF, you told us ISAF was established in December 2001, and we know immediately under the command of a US four-star, but ISAF has been described by you as being NATO commanded. At what point after 2001 did NATO take command?
So NATO took command of ISAF in August 2003.
And insofar as it now being a NATO-commanded operation, did that see command exercised from the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, which is in Brussels?
Yes. And then that was further delegated as part of the NATO structure through the NATO headquarters, which is Joint Forces Command in Brunssen in the Netherlands.
Did ISAF Joint Command have command of all of the subordinate regional commands in theatre?
Yes.
And when we think of regional command, you'd mentioned previously Regional Command Southwest, but do we have Regional Command Capital based in Kabul?
Yes.
Regional Command South based in Kandahar Airfield?
Yes.
Southwest at Camp Leatherneck in Helmand?
Yes.
West in Herat, east in Bagram Air Base, north in Mazar-e Sharif, and was each regional command commanded by a two-star officer?
Yes.
Throughout the campaign, whilst the ISAF command was a US four-star, was there also a separate US sovereign campaign being conducted?
Yes, which was known as Operation Enduring Freedom.
Can I just ask you about how you've got national US Enduring Freedom sitting alongside the international, what is now the NATO ISAF mission? Did they have one and the same overall commander?
Yes, they did, and they operated from the same headquarters, but they would make distinctions for certain types of operations, some which were within NATO and some which were then specific to the US under their Operation Enduring Freedom banner.
And was there a reason why they had the same commander of both the NATO ISAF-led command as well as the US operation under termed Enduring Freedom?
So that would be to allow a little bit more freedom, if it was required, for the US to conduct operations as the US. But I think the important point is that in 2009, those operations were aligned by command. So by making the ISAF commander and the commander of the US operation the same individual, that made it much more coherent. And during this period, it then meant that their capacity as the commander of Operation Enduring Freedom was also, it was the same individual who was Com ISAF.
And where you have one individual as Commander ISAF and Commander of Operation Enduring Freedom, is there a risk of any tension between those two roles?
There is, but if we go back to that previous conversation about red cards and where nations may not have exactly the same view of whether or not they're going to conduct the same operations, it's a way of managing that so that you're able to come to a sovereign position that a nation is comfortable with, and you conduct the operation quite clearly in a sovereign capacity without needing the agreement of all the other nations when you're operating as part of a coalition.
And was there a similar red card option that sat with the US 4-star that had sat with the UK 3-star?
I don't know, if I'm honest. So, because if it's in a national capacity, then the red card system doesn't apply. The red card system is a way of managing international coalitions. So you've got the authority to play a red card to say, as a sovereign nation, this is something that we didn't sign up to or were uncomfortable with. When it's a purely sovereign operation, then actually you don't anticipate that you need a red card. You just go up your own sovereign chain to reflect that actually a commander at a lower level might be uncomfortable with what they're being asked to do. But that's different to a red card process.
As far as the regional command that was relevant to UK forces from mid-2010 onwards, was the only relevant regional command that of Southwest?
Yes.
And that was based, as you said, at Camp Leatherneck, which was co-located with Camp Bastion?
Yes.
Can you help us, please, so that we can perhaps better understand how the deployment of sovereign UK forces sits alongside the international NATO role that they're playing? Because we've dealt with it with the question of the 3-star and the dual hats and the red card, but just so we get a better understanding of who's actually in charge. Could you help us with that, please, Admiral?
Yes, so the Task Force Helmand Commander was under the command of Regional Command Southwest, but at the same time, you're under the control of the UK National Component Commander in Kabul, who, if we go back to earlier in the day, is under the command of our Chief of Joint Operations back in Northwood at the Permanent Joint Headquarters. And then the generic piece is that for NATO, all troop contributing nations deployed on any NATO operation, they ultimately remain under the command of that nation. So that's where you then have the red card process. So that nation can limit the way in which those forces are used and can, if necessary, veto any order given through the NATO chain of command. So in what we've been describing, for UK forces on Operation Herrick, that veto was held by the National Component Commander. But as I explained before, because the National Component Commander was also the Deputy Commander of ISAF, that meant in practice, if there was a UK sovereign issue or concern with an intended NATO military order, we would anticipate that that would be resolved or discussed before those orders are issued. So you try to avert the need for the UK of needing to play your red card because of where you are in the command structure.
Where you've got two separate command structures that are sitting alongside each other, but that might not always be driving at the same point in time, Is there any risk for confusion or conflict there?
There is potentially, but that is the role of both headquarters to manage those risks and to avoid it becoming confusion, that actually you try to make this complementary and you acknowledge there might be some operations which are capable of being conducted in a sovereign sense and some operations that are best done in an international sense. And you manage that and you try to make that a virtue rather than a hindrance.
As far as, say, detention policies are concerned, are they governed by the multinational ISAF direction, or are they governed by individual sovereign command?
So the ISAF headquarters would provide an overall structure for the multinational deployment. So that would include setting high-level policy within a troop contributing nation's respective areas of operational responsibility. For detention policies, that would mean that each troop contributing nation would be conducting operations under its own policies as informed by both domestic and international law.
So in terms of the detention policies that were being used by UK forces, and of course we're still talking about conventional forces as far as your evidence is concerned, yes, that was governed by UK domestic and international law.
That's correct.
If we just step back from the military for a moment and think more in terms of the governance of Afghanistan, in particular the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, we've obviously got, as you've called it, an advisory and mentoring role that's happening in theatre by deployed troops. But what is the link between the government in Afghanistan and, say, the government of the United Kingdom? Is it all going through the military, or is there a separate route that sees it deal on a more governmental and civil basis?
So the government-to-government relationship is much more in the purview and the responsibility of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And the military is looking to complement the Foreign and Commonwealth's relationship with the Afghan government in this particular case, in the way that I described the provincial reconstruction teams are looking to complement the security situation with what was trying to be achieved really for and on behalf of the Afghan national government and what was trying to be achieved down at the district and province level. So this is then the responsibility at the government-to-government level is much more with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office.
So if we just return for a moment then to what is happening at district and provincial level, leaving the government for a moment and just descending into the more detailed area, you told us that as part of the mentoring team, there were links between, obviously, UK deployed forces and the Afghan National Defence Security Forces. And you told us the ANSDF was comprised of the ANA, the Afghan National Army, and the ANP, the Afghan National Police.
Yes.
And was there a clear partnership between both the ANA and the ANP and those people working within Task Force Helmand?
Yes, and we would expect the military commanders to have a strong working relationship with the relevant Afghan government officials in their area of operations.
And in terms of the purpose that lay behind the mentoring and advisory programme, do we have to have in mind what success in Afghanistan looked like, which was to put them and the Afghan government in a position to offer a secure and stable environment for the Afghan people to flourish, for the rule of law to flourish, and for democratic government to flourish?
Yes.
insofar as the Afghan National Army are concerned, are just dealing with Regional Command Southwest, which is the area with which UK forces were concerned, was there a partnership between the ANA and Task Force Helmand through the 3rd Brigade of the 215 Corps?
That's correct. And the 3rd Brigade headquarters was at Camp Shorabak, which was an Afghan National Army camp co-located with Camp Bastion.
So that deals with the Afghan National Army, which is one part of the ANDSF. The other part was the Afghan National Police. And at province level, was their headquarters in Lashkargah?
That's right.
And in terms of district levels, when you go beyond, or rather beneath Lashkargah, were there district level areas commanded by the ANP?
That's right.
Okay. And where were they, please?
So that was it. Nara Siraj, Nadal Ali and Lashnagar.
And was there a direct connection between UK forces and the ANP in order to effect the mentoring and advisory role?
Yes.
You've set out in the ensuing paragraphs the geographic locations of Operation Herrick 11 through to 18. And I'm not proposing to take you through that. It's in the body of your statement, and for those that want to look at it, they can do so in due course. What I'd like to turn to consider, please, together, is set out on your page 47, if I've got the pagination correct, but certainly it's paragraph 144 onwards, which is the evolution of UK operational policy and doctrine. And perhaps we can make a start of this before we have our mid-afternoon break. You've already touched upon the fact that throughout the period of their deployment, UK forces were operationally under the command of ISAF and therefore in service of ISAF strategy.
That's correct.
And as we've touched upon already, the primary objective, not only for UK forces but for ISAF, was to enable the Afghan government to provide effective security for its population.
Yes.
In terms of the shaping of ISAF strategy, presumably with each change of four-star commander, those individuals bring with them a different approach, a different philosophy, and that the strategy gets slightly reshaped each time.
Yes, not necessarily always a different approach or different philosophy, but it's not surprising that the commander taking charge and having that responsibility reviews what's going on, reflects on that, and then issues their orders about how the operations are going to be conducted during their time in command.
I mean, you'd identified one of the four stars as being General McChrystal, who I think you'd said took command in June of 2009.
Yes.
So just before the period with which we're concerned. As part of his arrival, did he request and receive higher troop numbers from the US President?
Yes, through the US Defense Secretary Robert Gates.
And was there any shift in strategy that was shaped by General McChrystal during his time as Commander ISAF?
Yes, so this was a significant shift that General McChrystal was keen to adjust from what he coined an enemy-centric strategy, which had previously been focusing on the physical destruction of insurgent forces, to a new strategy that was much more population-centric, focused on gaining the support of the Afghan people. So this, to quote him, was about moving away from a strategy that was focused on seizing terrain or destroying insurgent forces to the objective being much more around the population and gaining the consent and support of the population.
And is this a policy that became known as courageous restraint, but that's not a phrase that he actually used?
That's right. He never used that phrase, but that was its colloquialism.
And just considering that very briefly with your help, was the purpose of the policy, where possible, to avoid civilian casualties?
So the purpose of the policy was to gain the consent and support of the population, but as part of gaining that consent and support, it emphasised the need to avoid civilian casualties.
Presumably because getting their consent and support is harder to achieve if at the time civilian lives are being lost.
Yes.
And presumably there's also a danger where civilian lives are lost, that not only do you lose the hearts and minds, but you give force to the insurgency against you.
Yes, it works both ways. So the risk is that you lose hearts and minds of the people you're trying to persuade, and you actually generate more insurgents and you increase the weight of the enemy.
Because the danger with a civilian casualty is that not only do those who are immediately affected by it lose any support for the NATO presence, but it can be used to generate greater support for the insurgency, because those who want to are able to say civilians are being killed, they're being killed by Western forces, therefore Western forces aren't welcome here.
That's correct.
Now, that's a very crude way of describing it, and I'm not seeking to quote anybody, but I'm simply seeking to try to explain the danger that's presented by a civilian casualty is not only do you lose the hearts and minds, but you risk generating further support for the insurgency.
Yes, and it's why, we might get to it later, in some of the army publications, that particular point that you're describing is emphasised as one that is a crucial aspect to counterinsurgency operations.
And Admiral, does this translate into more recruits potentially?
Yes, more recruits for the insurgents.
Indeed.
Because you're losing the consent and support of the population. And if you are then have a population that is clearly against you, the risk is that the insurgency increases, and it's about a struggle almost then to stay in the area because you've got an insurgency that's trying to eject you. And you're then in a very difficult position because you're constantly battling to just maintain your ability to stay in the area, never mind persuading the population to gain their consent and support.
And just as a last point, perhaps before we break, just to pick up where we were a moment ago when you were talking about the directives that are in place, simply so that everyone has a chance to know what you've referred to. There was, of course, a CDS-issued directive in 2011 that made it clear that any civilian casualty, or at least any incident that may have resulted in a civilian casualty, had to be reported to the ISAF chain of command as soon as possible.
Yes.
So that there's a recognition that where civilian casualties may have occurred, those have to be reported so that appropriate action, if necessary, can be taken.
Yes, I'm not sure if it was the CDS directive. I think it was the COM-ISAF directive. It may have been reflected as well in the CDS directive, but it was definitely in the COM-ISAF directive.
Well, I'll make sure I've got the right document in due course, but would that be a convenient moment for a short break? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Glasgow. We will break now until 3:15, please. Thank you. Mr. Glasgow.
Please, you, sir. Admiral, could we just very quickly have a look at one of your exhibits in particular? And could I ask, please, that AR18 is brought up? You should find it in the black file you've just picked up for yourself. We've got here a Chief of Defence Staff directive for Operation Herrick. We looked at the bottom left, a date of the 31st of August of 2011. So we're dealing within the relevant period for the purposes of the inquiry. If we just look to the second page of the slides, we'll see a section here that's headed Legal ROE Rules of Engagement. And it deals with the legal basis for UK operations under NATO, UK activities in support of the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, or ISAF, are conducted by the consent of the government of Afghanistan. Just the last sentence, which I've highlighted here: any incident that may have resulted in CIVCAS, civilian casualty, must be reported to the ISAF chain of command as soon as practicable. So the onus on UK forces to report to the ISAF chain of command any civilian casualty that may have happened. So any incident that may have led to civilian casualties. Okay?
Yes, my apologies. I checked myself during the break that I knew it was in COMISAF's directive, but you're right, it was also reflected in the CDS directive for that period.
And in particular, this paragraph does draw attention to the COMISAF tactical directive.
Yes.
And clearly the significance that we have identified here of reporting is because, as you've told us, the danger posed by civilian casualties is you lose the hearts and minds on one hand and strengthen the insurgency on the other. So there's a need to grapple with civilian casualties if they may have occurred.
Yes, yes.
Now, just insofar as the strategy that was in place, and before we deal with any of the other commanders for ISAF, so we understand with your help the significance of ISAF strategy. Did it expand across the whole of Afghanistan?
Yes, it did.
So whilst UK forces are concerned with Regional Command Southwest, insofar as there are other regional commands, the same strategy was in place for each of them.
Yes.
Can we just, again, look to one of your exhibits, if you wouldn't mind? Could we look to AR19, which is, again, a Chief of Joint Operations Directive, this time dated October 2010, so just into the relevant period with which the inquiry is concerned. And if we look to the second slide, please, with your help, so that we can understand the objectives that had been put in place for Regional Command SW, that's Southwest. So this is the UK Regional Command area. And the operational design is described here as 4 prioritised security objectives. The overriding focus is to secure the central Helmand River Valley, followed by establishing a security lozenge along Highway 1 to the Durai Junction and linking up in the east with Regional Command South, when appropriate securing Route 611 north to the dam and clearing the upper Helmand River Valley, finally securing Highway 1 west to Delaram and interdicting the Highway 9 from Delaram to Saranj. Now, in terms of meeting the objectives, what I've done is taken the liberty of highlighting 4 key points that are made as part of the operational design. First, conduct comprehensive COIN, that's counter-insurgency operations, in the key population centres. Second, continue to strengthen and prepare the ANSF to be capable of shouldering additional security tasks with less assistance. Third, continue to support the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan in protecting the population. And finally, establish freedom of movement to a degree such that the population and the government can pursue routine daily activities, support the rule of law, and provide essential services. And those are all features of the evidence you've already given to us, but we see it here set out in a relatively comprehensive manner as the operational design for the regional command given to the UK forces. Now, insofar as those objectives that are set out and how they are to be met, first, conducting comprehensive coin operations. Very simply, can you just explain to us what counterinsurgency is? Because it's likely to be something that will feature during the inquiry, and it would help to have your explanation if we could.
So this is about countering an insurgency, where an insurgency is described as a political fight with military aspects, where you're fighting for, in our language, you're fighting for the support of the population. I can go to a more precise definition in some of the exhibits if necessary.
For the moment, I don't need you to turn to it, but if we need to in due course, of course we will. But just dealing with it at a slightly broad level, if we can, just at the moment. You've already told us, of course, that the strategy for General McChrystal when he took command in June 2009, so before this directive was issued, was in effect a population-centric strategy, but one that was focused on seizing terrain or destroying insurgent forces. So do we understand here that the comprehensive coin operations see almost two sides to them? On the one side, there is the need to seize terrain and destroy the insurgency. But on the other side, there's got to be a focus on the population to win the hearts and minds at the same time.
So that's correct. What I think these four are describing is that the need to try and create a safe and secure environment. So you're countering the insurgency, and that might involve deliberate use of force where necessary, but you're trying to do it in a way that supports your ambition to win over the population. And you're also trying to support the Afghanistan authorities, so whether that's the district governor and the civilian side, or the police, or on the military side, the Afghan National Army, so to grow their capability to be able to look after their own country. And then you're trying to do that to such an extent that you might be able to hand over to the Afghan authorities, and you've created between you the support of the population at the same time as removing the support of the population from the insurgents, and where necessary, removing the insurgents themselves. And it's that blend and that combination that I think is being described in those four sub-paras.
Presumably, when considering the insurgency and whether or not it can or could be removed at all, it is the importance that you don't want to leave in 2014 and to leave behind a problem with the insurgency that the government and the ANSDF can't cope with.
Absolutely.
Can we just go back to the shaping of ISAF strategy and just leave that document for a moment, please, if you wouldn't mind? You'd explained that General McChrystal had secured an increase in troop numbers, and I think in terms of the numbers, were US personnel increased by some 30,000 at the end of 2009?
Yeah, 30,000 American personnel, and a further 10,000 from the other members of the coalition, which included 500 from the UK.
And did that take the total ISAF force to about 150,000 people?
Yes, 150,000 by the end of 2010.
And then in June of 2010, before we hit that 150,000 figure, of course, General Petraeus replaced General McChrystal, and it was General Petraeus who became ISAF commander.
Yes.
And at that stage, is that when the timetable was set for the ISAF handover to Afghanistan's and its security forces and government?
Yes, so that was the more dominant change. So some things remain the same. So the approach that General McChrystal had outlined, that population-centric approach, was endorsed and continued by General Petraeus. But the piece that I think is relevant here, and the adjustment under General Petraeus, is there is a much clearer timetable for that handover from ISAF to the Afghan security forces.
So everyone has a date that they are now working towards. And does that timetable, in a sense, shape the operational activity in this period?
Yes, it does. And it's aimed with an ambition for the Afghan security forces to be in the lead for all security operations across Afghanistan by December 2014.
And to leave the government in a position where it can function as a democratic government, where rule of law can be maintained, and where the people are safe.
Yes.
And hopefully where there is, if there is still an insurgency problem, one that the ANSDF is able to cope with.
Yes, so that you have achieved the handover to much more of a normal arrangement where the country's security forces are in the lead, and you might still be in a supporting role, but it's very clear that the country's own security forces are the dominant players in providing the security, as opposed to where we've been beforehand, with the international coalition being the dominant ones providing security for the nation.
And in terms of the interaction between sovereign or ISAF forces and the Afghan forces, does the role slip from mentoring to advisory, if we slide along that scale?
Yes, so you see a transition, so from supporting the ANDSF, and then mentoring, and then enabling, and then sustaining them. And it's that adjustment that we start to see.
And we'll come to consider that in a little more detail in a moment. But just whilst we're dealing with the handover, so we can fix some dates if we can, please. The three districts within the Task Force Helmand area of operations, what was the transition from UK sovereign forces to Afghan forces, and what was the timetable for that, please? If it helps,
yes.
I think you'll find it in your paragraph 154.
I've got it. So this is the mechanism by which President Karzai's declaration that the ANDSF must be in the lead by December 2014 then gets broken down to individual areas, so that for those that are the areas within Task Force Helmand, Lashkar to be transitioned within Tranche 1, which was announced by President Karzai in March 2011. Nadal Ali district in Tranche 2, which was announced in November 2011. And then the Garesh district in Tranche 3, announced in May 2012. And so by November 2012, the transition of those three districts had been completed, with the ANDSF now in the security lead, and UK forces assuming an advisory role rather than a partnering relationship, and that then allowed UK forces to start to draw down from their forward operating bases.
And in terms of the approach to the transition, you touched upon the different stages a moment ago. Can we just look at those in a little more detail, please? So that's your paragraph 155.
Yes, so 4 stages are described. So in stage 1, known as support, and that's where the ANDSF would assume the lead security authority, but be partnered by those UK ground manoeuvre force elements. Then you go to a mentoring role as stage 2. So the ANDSF in the lead for all framework operations, ISAF continuing to partner, but the ANDSF capabilities are growing, and it's much more of a mentoring relationship across most of the force. And with a backstop of UK forces being able to respond, what we call quick reaction forces, if that was needed, where the ANDSF needed additional help. Then you move to stage 3, which is called enable, and that's defined by the point at which ISAF battle groups were now in an advisory relationship with their ANDSF partners, much smaller teams of ISAF in that role, and much less of a combat capability further forward and visible. And then you go to a final stage, stage 4, sustain, where then you're seeing ISAF retain an advisory role, but really an advisory role at the battle group headquarters level, rather than being alongside the ANDSF. It's more of a shaping, organising, planning role, and it's the ANDSF who are providing the force on the ground, and they're doing the operations on the ground.
So the 4 stages you've just described effectively give less direct support with each stage. And over what period of time were those stages implemented, please?
So this is over, I'm just looking now, for several years.
I mean, you've been able to assist us that the transition of the 3 districts in Helmand was by November 2012.
Yes, and then this then further completes by, my understanding is that's then completed in a further 2 cycles of Operation Herrick that takes us into 2014.
So in effect, the provincial reconstruction team that TFH have been working towards, that is almost signed off, as it were, in March of 2014.
Yes.
So we need to imagine that over the previous months and years, we've gone through the separate stages, and at that point, is there confidence that the ANDSF are in a position to do what is necessary and the government will survive?
Yes.
Obviously, that ultimately takes us to outside the relevant period with which the inquiry is concerned. But up until the closure of the Helmand Provincial Reconstruction Team, do we still have to consider, therefore, that UK forces are at least sustaining sustaining the Afghan forces, if not possibly even enabling them in that cycle of support that you've told us about?
So enabling and sustaining, but far less prominent in terms of UK forces being on the ground and operating at a slightly higher level in terms of their relationship with the ANDSF.
Insofar as the operational approach that the UK sovereign forces had and how that fits in with the ISAF strategy, can we please, just with your help, turn to look at one of your exhibits, which is AR26. AR26 is the British Army Field Manual and the section that deals with counterinsurgency. And if we just turn over to the next slide, please, we have 10 principles for counterinsurgency: primacy of political purpose, unity of effort, understand the human terrain, secure the population, neutralize the insurgent, gain and maintain popular support, operate in accordance with the law, integrate intelligence, prepare for the long term, learn and adapt. insofar as those 10 principles are concerned, we can clearly see secure the population and neutralise the insurgent, and then gain and maintain popular support and operating in accordance with the law. And when I've just asked you questions about civilian casualties, we can see how, where civilian casualties may have occurred, how that may play into 4 of those 10 principles, certainly relevant to the 4 that I've just asked you about. Can we just, in the same document, turn on to the next slide and to look at the section which deals with operating in accordance with the law? And I've highlighted 2 sections that I'd just like to draw to your attention, if I may, please, Admiral. Section 332, which identifies there have been instances in the recent past where it was alleged and occasionally subsequently proven that British forces broke the law. Irrespective of whether the allegations are proven or not, the consequences of the allegations or crimes have major implications for the conduct of the campaign and the overall reputation and standing of the United Kingdom. And then if we look towards the bottom of that same paragraph, areas that require careful consideration and explicit policy and training include the use of force, the conduct of search operations, detention, and questioning. No matter what the circumstances, expediency is not an excuse to operate outside the law.
Yes.
To expand on those principles, Admiral.
So I think there are two issues here which we should sort of reflect on, and they join, but they're also separate. So the 10 principles that you outlined, I think, is a UK version, and it mirrors much of the thinking that we've discussed before about General McChrystal and what he was looking to impose. And that is this idea that in counterinsurgencies you need to win over the population, and that drains the insurgency of support as well as people, and it marginalises those irreconcilable insurgents. So that's what you're trying to do, and you're trying to build security for the nation, and you're trying to normalise the arrangements so that the nation's government is in control and its security apparatus is the one that has the authority. A fundamental part of that, in terms of your confidence and the receptiveness of that process with the host population, is that you're doing it in a manner which is going to be acceptable to that host population, so that you can gain their support. So I think those are general tenets. But then, in addition to that, is the legal requirement that you act within the law, and that is always the case. But being safely within the law and in the vein of this strategy whereby you're trying to win over the population becomes very important. And the counterinsurgency manual, it just is emphasising those points.
Because ultimately, if your forces act outside the law, or there are allegations that they have acted outside the law, it undoes all the good work that might have been done hitherto.
Potentially, yes.
Leave aside whether there's actually been a crime committed, we're dealing here not just with crimes, but allegations of crimes that have major implications for conduct of the campaign and the overall reputation and standing of the country.
Yes.
Can we leave that document for a moment? We may come back to it to look at some other sections of it in due course. Insofar as the population-centric approach is concerned, so that is one that was started by General McChrystal continued, as you told us, by General Petraeus, and one that is trying to use a balance between active counterinsurgency and at the same time winning hearts and minds and not injuring the civilian population. Is there a tension when you're conducting operations that are aimed at insurgents and also protecting the civilian population at the same time?
I think there's both a tension and the complexity and difficulty of that, when by the nature of insurgencies, you're not opposing a state army. You're actually dealing with people who have the ability to meld into the population, and the complexity of that adds to some of that tension. And then you've got other tensions in terms of the way that you conduct operations so that you keep ensuring that you have the support of the population. And I'm sure later in the inquiry you'll go into much more detail to understand that texture and the difficulty with that, and then how it's managed. But it's more than the tension that you described. I think it's the complexity of the broader operational footprint and what you're trying to achieve, and how difficult that is when you're operating in and amongst the population, and the insurgents are operating in and amongst the population as well.
And you've identified that, where appropriate, the use of deliberate or offensive force could be authorised.
Yes.
And that's, of course, the use of force that's not in self-defence. And also, of course, self-defence, so defensive force can be used where appropriate, but throughout either offensive or defensive force, are the UK forces expected to behave at all times within the law?
Absolutely.
And where possible to avoid civilian casualties?
Yes.
Can we just very briefly look to another of your exhibits, which is your AR20, which is the Army Doctrine publication on operations. We see the front piece here, but if we turn to the next slide, please, dealing with the application and threat of force. And it's perhaps obvious, but the raison d'etre for armed forces is to fight. What I've identified here is as follows: lethal force should not be applied for its own sake, but to achieve the ends set. If these ends can be achieved by persuasion rather than coercion, or prevention rather than intervention, the course of implied rather than applied force should be taken.
Yes.
So a note of caution being given there, that whilst the raison d'etre of armed forces is to fight, there may be occasions where it's appropriate not to fight, but to persuade instead.
Yes, I think the point is the purpose is not to fight. The purpose is to achieve the end set. And if you can do that without having to fight, then that is going to be a better outcome.
Clearly, this is material that is provided in a number of publications and in a number of directives, but essentially it must be something that you expect of anyone who is a UK service personnel member.
Yes.
But it doesn't really need to be taught, does it?
I think it does have to be taught, because it's such a fundamental of our creed and ethos. And then it's in terms of being cautious about the use of force, and also about being really clear on the legal responsibility where servicemen and women are given this extraordinary responsibility where, on behalf of the state, they are able to use force. And so I would disagree. It is something that needs to be taught. And it is taught from when people join and then consistently taught all the way through.
And was it part of the pre-deployment package that OPTAG delivered to UK servicemen and women before they are deployed on OPERIC?
Yes, it would be.
Can I turn to deal with a different chapter, if I may, please? And can I ask you about the insurgency and the adversary threat? You've set this out in your statement at paragraphs 164 onwards, and it may be that this is a chapter we're able, I hope, to finish before we have to break for the day. And for your peace of mind, Admiral, although we didn't start clean today and we're going to go into tomorrow, I would anticipate concluding your evidence before lunch tomorrow if we start tomorrow morning in good time.
Right, thank you.
So can I take you, please, to paragraph 164? And is it fair to say that during the course of the relevant period with which we're concerned, that the insurgents were generally labelled as the Taliban?
Yes.
And within that group of the Taliban, do we need in a moment to break down the difference between the various memberships that there are so that we understand the difference between, say, full-time fighters and those who are less involved?
Yes, so full-time fighters we would describe as the minority but the ideological core. Part-time fighters were from those groups whose motivations varied, but they form part of the wider Taliban. And then we describe a third tier known as enablers, which are people that may have enabled Taliban activity, whether that's planting IEDs or acting as scouts or being informants, but they weren't necessarily strong followers, and in some ways they may have been brought in almost as mini mercenaries in order to support, but they were able to fulfill that enabling function.
Notwithstanding the particular tier that any individual might have occupied, nonetheless were they generally labelled as the Taliban or Taliban fighters?
That's right.
Just focusing on the insurgency in Helmand, did the insurgency operate a system of shadow government in Helmand?
Yes, both at province and district level. And in many ways, the way that we saw that was matching the structure of the Afghan government, but in a shadow Taliban structure that they had in place.
We've touched upon the ISAF and the sovereign strategy. Are you able to help us with what, if anything, was the insurgent strategy?
Yes, we saw that as being firstly to impose casualties on ISAF as part of that encouragement for ISAF to leave Afghanistan and be ejected. Secondly, to undermine the rule of the Afghan government, and that was through direct attacks on the DSF, as well as civilians working for the Afghan government. And thirdly, the insurgency was trying to control the local population, sometimes by intimidation, but also through its shadow governance system.
Insofar as there being a core minority of the ideological members, we'll see in some of the documentation in due course that the Taliban sometimes is described as a franchise movement. Are you able to help us with what that means? Because it may be that people hear the phrase the Taliban and they think to themselves of an ideological group who are wedded to a particular cause. But in terms of what the Taliban means as a franchise movement, what is that, please, Admiral Radakin?
So this is a description that we gave to try and reflect those groups who might not be ideologically committed to the Taliban, but they had their own reasons to join and franchise with the Taliban to further their own aims. So that might be the aims of a group because they were a particular tribe and they wanted to gain a local political benefit and they were opposed to a national Afghan government. And then there might be other groups, such as some of the narco gangs, who had no ideological affinity with the Taliban, but they had criminal reasons why it might suit them, either for a period of time or for a period of geography, to be alongside the Taliban and involved in Taliban operations.
Insofar as guidance was available, could we just look, please, together for a moment at another of your exhibits, which is AR37, which is the operational guide for Op Herrick 18. And I hope you've got it there in the file available to you. Could we just look together at the, if we turn to the front piece slide, we can see here, Op Herrick operational guide for Op Herrick 18. And if we just turn to the next page, please, together, we can see that in the bottom right, the insurgent campaign has been divided, just as you've told us, into full-time, part-time, and enablers. If we look to the paragraph above it, the Helmand insurgency, it begins. I'll just wait for you to find, is it not in the file I've given you? Can I give you my copy?
Wait. Just looking for what number did you say it was?
Let me pass it to Admiral.
Thank you.
37, I think.
Thank you. Oh, 37. I'm sure it's here. Yeah. I've got it. Thank you.
The Helmand insurgency has therefore been described as having three pillars. The ideological core of the insurgent we fight is categorised into the full-time, but they're reliant on part-time reinforcement in the form of both fighters and enablers to support and sustain them. Because of the nature of the part-time element, it makes it extremely difficult to quantify exact insurgent numbers in a particular location or establish battle damage assessment in the aftermath of an engagement. In terms of making it difficult to quantify exact insurgent numbers or establish battle damage assessment in the aftermath of an engagement, is that because in the division of the three tiers of full, part and enablers, that if one's dealing with enablers, it might be hard to tell an enabler from someone else?
Yes. So I think you can understand that for all three groups, as I said before, their ability to merge into the population makes it difficult, but there are some that it's even easier for them to merge into the population. And that is a difficulty. But there are others who are much better qualified than me and had the experience of campaigns in Afghanistan to expand on that further.
And we will, I hope, hear from them in due course. Can we turn to consider the techniques, tactics and procedures of the insurgents? And it may just be a topic that we can conclude this afternoon. I'm going to invite you, please, to look in your statement at paragraph 171 onwards. And we'd already touched upon the NATO, ISAF and UK sovereign force development, so that the learning that had taken place during the course of the campaign and the way that that had been fed through various chains and meetings so that mistakes might not be repeated where possible, of course. Did you see the same sort of development within the insurgent campaign so that they were learning and how to change their approach?
Yes, And I don't think it's too surprising that those adjustments, unsurprisingly, over a long period of time, the way that the insurgency operates and what they learn from the way that the coalition was operating, that they refine their approach as well. But again, there are others who are much better qualified than me to give you the detail of that.
And I don't propose to descend into the detail this afternoon, but could we just touch upon some of what you've set out in your statement? You'd identified that the common targets for the insurgency included coalition operating bases, training establishments, temporary patrol bases, and lines of communication, particularly roads that might link the coalition bases.
Yes, and that was part of their adjusting their techniques, tactics and procedures as a response to the way that ISAF and the ANDSF were operating.
Insofar as they had particular tactics which were deployed, can you take us through the eight particular tactics that you've set out in your statement, please, Admiral?
Yes, so at the tactical level, we describe a reconnaissance screen so that the insurgents would operate a reconnaissance screen around coalition patrol bases so that they were aware of the movements of either the ISAF or ANDSF forces. So that was simple. It was a screen that comprised of individuals, sometimes children, with radios and reporting what was going on and what could be seen. The second element concerned IED belts and mobile defence. So behind the reconnaissance screen, you then had IED belts that were utilised to defend insurgent areas. So by this we mean IEDs that have been planted in a deliberate way, but then covered by small arms and rocket-propelled grenade launchers from various firing points on that area. That meant that when coalition force operations were anticipated, you had this complexity of areas that were effectively booby-trapped, and then they were, when the explosion happened, you would then have engagements from the Taliban. The third element is around counter-surveillance. So the insurgents developed an understanding of what the ISAF tactics and procedures were, and they looked to exploit those. And that involved things such as using children as human shields, particularly when they were trying to lay IEDs, or when they were trying to move weapons, because they were always conscious that there was a risk of being seen from the overhead, so whether it's our aircraft that were in the sky or drones, and this was about trying to have as limited a time as possible where they were on the ground, where they might be attacked. And they knew about our emphasis on not wanting to take civilian casualties. The fourth element in terms of their procedures is a conventional attack. So this is that the insurgents would typically see a high rate of fire for 2 to 3 minutes, followed by attempts to flank coalition forces. So we call these attacks contacts. They were relatively brief and would last about 15 to 20 minutes, because the insurgents, having conducted that attack, would then want to break away, because part of our procedures were to bring in much greater levels of force, and that would be a disadvantage for the insurgents. So an intensity for 2 to 3 minutes, the attack carrying on for a further 15 minutes or so, and then they're looking to melt away. The fifth element is what we call a counter-air assault. So insurgents understood the threat from air assault and would attempt to analyse likely landing zones and consider how best to counter any such operation. So they understood our helicopters, they understood our medical evacuation procedures, and they used those as an opportunity to be able to attack coalition forces. The sixth element was suicide attacks. And while suicide bombers were relatively rare, the suicide bomber attacks happened occasionally, whether by individuals on foot or in a vehicle. And then the seventh element is what we called green on blue attacks. And this was a particular technique used by the insurgency from 2009 onwards. And that was to encourage soldiers who were part of the Afghan National Army or policemen as part of the Afghan National Police to attack their ISAF partners. And that was coined as green on blue. And then the final tactical element that we've seen was the use of human shields. So the use of women and children to hide behind, and particularly to hide behind them when the insurgents were in a firing position, because they were very aware, as I said, of the ISAF constraint about avoiding civilian casualties. So those are 8 tactical descriptions of where we saw the Taliban operating and the Taliban adjusting their techniques and procedures and tactics in response to their observation of coalition tactics, techniques and procedures.
And as you've touched upon a number of times, they having recognised what came to be termed courageous restraint, so the desire to avoid civilian casualties, saw them exploit the civilian population either by using women or children to provide cover or to provide information or to exploit them as best as they could.
Yes.
Now, you've mentioned among those 8 tactics the use of IED belts and mobile defence, but can I just ask you in particular about IEDs, so improvised explosive devices? It's something that the public will have heard a lot about, particularly in terms of the time that the UK forces and NATO forces and US forces were deployed in Afghanistan. Was there a period when UK forces began to recognise and appreciate that there was an increase in the use of IEDs to target ISAF or UK forces?
Yes, so the adjustment was in 2009. So prior to that, in the period 2006 to 2008, most of the attacks involved small arms, whether that's AK-47s or RPGs, rocket-propelled guns. But also, it went to a shift from 2009 onwards, where those were still being used, but IEDs were now much more coming to the fore, not to just harm ISAF and Afghan security forces, but also to constrain the way that ISAF and Afghan security forces were able to maneuver in their areas of operation.
Is there any particular reason that might lie behind the change of approach that left behind small arms and led to a focus on IEDs?
Well, I think there are several things that they were then able to impose on coalition and Afghan forces. So it meant that the movement of coalition forces was much slower because of the IED risk. It meant that soldiers who were going out were also having to have more personal protection in order to try and mitigate against the risk. And it meant that they were able to impose that penalty on the coalition forces and just make it much more difficult for coalition forces to be operating in their areas of operation, as well as operating alongside their Afghan security forces. But there were, and then it impacts on the psychology when they were successful in those IED attacks, back to their earlier procedures, and knowing our tactics for bringing the medivacs in, so bringing the helicopter in to take wounded personnel out, then created another opportunity for them to be able to attack. So it was this multiple impacts of the IED approach.
And presumably, given the nature of an IED and how it's planted, these are explosive devices that are targeted at coalition forces who are mobile on foot or mobile in a vehicle.
Yes.
Because in the main, they're planted in an area where it's anticipated coalition forces will be walking or driving through to have maximum effect.
Yes.
And does that mean that often they were planted close to coalition bases on natural egress and ingress routes so that it could catch or had a greater chance of catching a patrol?
Yes. And it's the psychological impact on the young men and women that are serving in Afghanistan, and with this sense of an increased threat and their need to take additional protection. So it's more than just the impact on being able to maneuver on the ground. It's more than the risk of being killed or wounded. It's the psychological impact as well. And when you come back to that role of trying to reassure a population as to who is in control and who is providing security, then this is a way of undermining the coalition forces and asserting the insurgency. So I think it's all of those factors.
In terms of the IEDs themselves, did the insurgency develop means to try to avoid IEDs being found?
Yes, so they adjusted over time. So some were custom built, which we thought came from outside Afghanistan. Then there were IEDs that were very simple but built within Afghanistan. And then there were ways that they were operated that tried to hide which type of IED they were, and to make it more difficult for the coalition forces or the Afghan forces that were operating there, because there are different types of initiation for how an IED works.
Can we just deal with those briefly if there's still time, please, Admiral? I think within your statement you'd identified the command wire or command pull, the radio controlled and the victim operated as being three ways in which IEDs could be exploded, and then there's a secondary IED that can also be deployed. So could we just have your help with that, please?
Yes, so the command wire or command pull is the simplest switch for an IED. So the device initiates when an electrical circuit is completed. The command wire will be concealed using natural features, and then it's detonated by a command pull, but it may be detonated by a trigger event when the wire is pulled to make the circuit, or a command pull is similar, except the device is triggered by pulling a string to complete the circuit at the right moment. The radio controlled is one where there's no physical link between the firing point and the device, and a radio device was usually used to initiate an explosion, but sometimes mobile phones were used, or keyless entry systems were used instead. The third type you mentioned was victim operated. So that's initiated when a person steps on a pressure plate, or it could be operated by a vehicle there, whereby the pressure acts as the way that the device is detonated. And secondary IEDs is the description when secondary IEDs were put in places that were anticipated to be the areas where soldiers would take cover after an event, after the initial event. And therefore there was then, in a way, a secondary attack that follows from the first IED detonation.
And as you said, what was noted by coalition forces was an increase in the use of IEDs from 2009 onwards. And did that lead to an increase in fatalities and casualties among the coalition forces?
Sadly, it did. And if you want to know the total number of UK personnel that were killed or wounded, I can go into those details.
If you could, please, and that may be an appropriate moment for today. So if we just turn to consider that, set out in your paragraph 200, which deals with the total number of fatalities and casualties in the period the 1st of April 2006 to the 30th of November 2014. Can you help us with that, please?
So sadly, during this period, the total number of personnel who were killed in action or died of wounds was 402 individuals, and the total number of people who sustained battle injuries was 2,319 individuals.
So roughly an 8-year period in which 402 UK service personnel lost their lives and 2,319 sustained battle injuries.
Yes.
I'm going to turn to deal with a different chapter. I don't know whether now might be an appropriate moment for the day, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Glasgow. Admiral, if we can reconvene at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. I think Mr. Glasgow's plan is to try and ensure we finish by lunchtime tomorrow.
Yes, sir, it is.
Good. And could I remind you, please, not to discuss your evidence with anybody during this break? Thank you, everybody, for today. We will reconvene, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Thank you.